All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Epistemai's 2024 Undergraduate Philosophy Conference. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Today we're going to get the chance to hear from some really great speakers, talk about some of the work they've done. So really excited to get to that for everyone. Please note for the people in the room, this event is being recorded. We will post this on the Epistemai YouTube channel later on. So if anyone wants to share this with anyone who didn't get the chance to watch it today, there will be an opportunity in the future to share that with people. All right, so just a brief schedule. So it's going to be isolation, mourning, and reorientation in Aristotle's melancholic condition first. Then we'll have a Kierkegaardian critique of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological reflection. Then we'll get orders of worlds and type conditionalization. Finally, on loving the unknowable, and then we're going to end with our keynote speech by Professor Allenbach. So, we also just wanted to thank all of our student speakers, of course. Thank you guys so much for coming, for working really hard, and for sharing that work with us. Thank you to the conference planning team. Thank you, Jake, and Thomas and Elliot, and our friend Cameron, who wasn't here today, but he did a lot of help on the back end. Thanks to Professor St. Croix. She was very helpful, gave some really useful advice. And thank you to Judy Grandbois, who was also very instrumental in putting this together. So yeah, thanks. And thank you guys for joining us. So the way this is going to work is we're going to have our first speaker present. And then once they're done, there will be a few minutes for Q&A. Jake will be leading the Q&A. So if you're in the chat, please put your questions in the Q&A section. Or if you really want to ask your questions out loud, you can just raise your hand and Jake will call on the person to ask their question next. And if you're in the room and have a question, of course, just raise your hand and we'll call on you there as well. So thank you guys very much. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Bela.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I will just share my screen and then I'll get started. Okay. All right. So thank you all for being here. My presentation, its title has changed slightly, but it is called Mourning, Isolation, and Love in the Melancholic Condition. I'm going to try and be mapping those things in the historical literature today. So let me just start by saying, like, I'm not a psychologist or a student of psychology. So obviously I'm not trying to make like claims about particular psychiatric conditions in this presentation, but there is like an extensive corpus of literature surrounding the melancholic condition going all the way back to ancient Greece and even the Islamic Golden Age. And obviously there's no surefire way to know exactly what that literature is talking about in modern terms, but based on the symptomatology described in all of that literature, I actually had a professor who put together like 2,000 years worth of material on melancholia, madness, mania, and manic depression into a really cohesive class syllabus last year. And it ended up becoming a very rich historical and philosophical discussion. So that's where this paper came from. So without further ado, I will open with like the foundational question from that class itself, which ended up sparking the idea for this work. It was from the slide. Why is it that all of those men who have become extraordinary in philosophy, politics, poetry, or the arts are obviously melancholic? I wondered, and everyone in the class wondered for many months, how it could be possible that a condition that produces such immense suffering and a really complex set of symptomatology that we'll get into in a minute, how that could be generalized, and generalized by Aristotle, no less, by the stereotype connecting madness with genius. And I think this is especially interesting because the melancholic condition in question is also like culturally connected with like craziness, madness, and divergence from normalcy. And I probably won't have time in this presentation to directly address the question of like genius or brilliance explicitly, because I'll be focusing more on the proliferation of artistic and intellectual creation in the condition, rather than its quality or its perceived greatness or anything like that. But I'd be happy to think more about that in the Q&A. So in this presentation, I want to first draw attention to the bifurcation of the symptomatology that most of the literature seems to agree on. whether it's framed as like a physical temperature of the black bile in the body, or the figurative cold and hot psychologies of emotional states. There seem to be two general categories under which behavior in the melancholic condition are categorized. So Aristotle says that the melancholic condition is caused by an excess of black bile in the body, which gives the condition its name. Melancholic means black bile. So when the black bile is cold, he says, the subject exhibits torpor or spiritlessness or fear. And when it is hot, you get the opposite, and three general types of heated behavior. You get high spirits, talkativeness, and visible madness, then lust, love, and affection toward others, and then the last, which is the issue we started with, prolific intellectual and artistic creation and creative brilliance. So on the one hand, you have this like quiet, isolated state of mind, and on the other, the high energy, extroverted, verbose one. So my goal in this presentation is to generate as comprehensive of an understanding as I can of those heated sets of behaviors specifically. And hopefully that'll get us to an understanding of the various symptoms I just described as all manifestations of like one articulable desire, which I'll talk about in a second. I'll try to roadmap this as clearly as I can because there's a lot of material here. So I'm going to be explicit about each move I'm going to make in advance, and then we can get into the content. So step one will be to demonstrate the intellectual disjunction of the condition, which I'm thinking of as like a discursive alterity, which just basically means that the melancholic person understands the world in a significantly different way from what is socially typical. Again, it's outside of the scope of this presentation to explain like why that might be the case, although there is a lot of Aristotelian literature to suggest that memory and experience formation and pattern recognition are all slightly altered in this condition, that changes the way that melancholics view the world. But regardless, the intellectual divergence is what's typically referred to as like the madness or even insanity in this condition, because it just doesn't make sense from the outside. It's different from the way others understand the world around them and other people themselves. So that leads us to step two, the affect or feeling of disjunction, which is the melancholic sense of isolation and difference resulting from that intellectual disconnection from the people and the world around them, which we just saw. So they've understood that they understand things differently from other people, and that's what isolates them from the world of others and leaves them feeling alone, which is of course tied into step three, loss, in which the melancholic actually undergoes feelings of grief and mourning because of their having lost the world of others that they have now realized that they're not a part of. I'll draw from some Freud, to talk a little bit about what that mourning entails. And then, of course, that leads us to step four, acts of love or the urge to reorientation. This is that single desire that I said I would talk about, and that'll hopefully help us explain some of those heated behavioral marks that we saw on the previous slide. So as a result of feeling that they've lost the world and everyone in it, the melancholic seeks to reconnect with the exterior. And I think that urge to reconnection can look like a lot of different things. I'd like to argue that those seemingly disparate segments of the heated condition, namely the creative brilliance on one hand and affection toward others and lust on the other hand, reflect that single desire to project the internal world onto the exterior in a bid to sort of reorient to the shared understanding and to the social world of others. And before I move on, I'll just say that by calling these like steps in this numbered list, I don't mean to be making like any kind of chronological claims. That's not to suggest that, you know, the melancholic wakes up one day, first feels mad, then feels sad. Like it's nothing like that. Less like a timeline and more, I think, like a logical sequence. So I'll get into the content now. There we go. One of the first things that the literature seems to agree on is that melancholia is characterized by intellectual or logical divergence. It's usually construed as like poor judgment, irrational behavior, and even fallacious modes of understanding. I have a bunch of just quotes up on the screen, and I'll talk about some of them. Avicenna describes a greatness of fear of things which are not customarily feared, and Aristotle talks about an inclination to like kiss an unlikely partner. So they're contrasting in both of these quotes what is like customary, what is likely, what is typical and normal from what is characteristic of the melancholic, which to me suggests that what's going on in actually all of these examples is a difference of perspective or a difference of reason that prevents the melancholic from thinking the way other people do. In the bottom two quotes, I won't read these aloud, but please feel free to peruse, and I'm happy to go back to any of this in the Q&A. So from Plath and Carroll, we can see that the melancholic in question like can't bring themselves to think typically about hair washing or laundry or pencil sharpeners. The clearest thing I think coming out of all of these quotes is difference or divergence. I think the Plath quote actually is especially telling. She says that the way people typically think about everyday chores that they should be done every day seems silly to her, and she's essentially having trouble understanding the importance of things that seem really important to everybody else. So this is the first step. It's a psychological alterity that isolates the melancholic in their individual discourse or their sort of their individual frame of understanding. All right, so let me say quickly that Kay Jamison's book, Touched with Fire, which is from 1993, was like a massive resource in writing this paper. I know 1993 isn't that long ago, but I do consider this book part of the like historical literature on melancholia and its related conditions, especially given that Jamison cites like 100 books from the 20th century. It was a great resource, and she's got a really good quote here at the top that I think helps explain the isolation that results from the melancholic's intellectual difference, that they have, quote, an inflated self-esteem as well as a certainty of conviction about the correctness and importance of their ideas. If we understand that the melancholic is like effectively alone in their intellectual system, sort of the sole proprietor of their way of understanding the world, then I think it makes perfect sense that they would consider all of their ideas like perfectly correct and of the utmost importance, because to the melancholic, their ideas are the only ones in their world. They have no intellectual compatriots with whom to check or verify what they believe to be true. The only thing that determines their world is themselves. So of course, they would feel that their opinion about things are right. So this leads us to affective disjunction, which simply put is the felt isolation that stems from the condition. These two quotes here and here display, I think, the consequences of the melancholic's recognition that they're isolated from others, that they feel themselves to be totally alone in the universe. I'll give you a moment to read these quotes from Thomas and Berlioz's. Yeah, and by presenting this material in like a formal philosophical setting, I don't want to risk like erasing or brushing past the fact that a lot of this is about feeling and that that's really important. To me, affective disjunction really is the critical step here, because feeling alone is an incredibly powerful emotional motivator that leads to the next two steps, which are logically posterior to this feeling of disjunction from other people. So following that, now comes, I think, the really important part. The melancholic finds themselves totally isolated, but they can also see the world that they've left behind, in a sense. Jameson's specific words here, I think, are really actually important, that the world of others is unobtainable. It's even visible, but it's not habitable. It is there, but it's not there for the melancholic. And I don't think it's possible to overstate like the devastation that a recognition like that can bring. That the world that everyone else seems to enjoy, the world that the melancholic can even recognize as like bright and beautiful in the abstract, to them is sterile, uninhabitable, even foul and pestilent, in that second quote from Hamlet right there. So, in Mourning and Melancholia, Freud describes a really tight connection between those two words in the title, mourning and melancholia, and says that melancholia often manifests like mourning, but without a clear cause. I hope that after what we saw in the last two slides, it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to suggest that the loss that the melancholic is mourning is actually a loss of everything, of the world, of other people, even of a sense of self that derives from the connection to the exterior. I don't think it's surprising really that melancholia and grief often present really similarly. I might even go so far as to say that melancholia involves grief in the way that Freud describes it in this piece, for the loss of the world of others that the melancholic feels. So Freud says that mourning of any sort results from the loss of a cathetic object, which is just any object that we have an emotional investment in. And he also says that mourning can lead someone to run after, quote, new object cathexis, like a starving man after bread. That is to say that mourning can lead you to frantically, desperately try to fill the gap that the grief has left by attaching to something new and relieving the emptiness of that grief. So where does that leave the melancholic? They've lost the world of others. So I want to propose that what constitutes their running after new object cathexis are the acts of love that I said I would talk about in the beginning of this discussion. So I said that I would try to bring together two seemingly unrelated patterns of behavior. That is the affection and lust on one hand, and the creative sort of proliferation on the other. So this is the culmination of that attempt. This is the first half, where I think the urge to reorientation or reconnection can present in frantic extroversions, a feverish reaching out to friends, way too many phone calls, or kissing unlikely partners, as we talked about earlier, excuse me. And I included right here this quote from the symposium, which is Diotima talking to Socrates about love, where she says that when someone keeps company with a beautiful partner, he, quote, conceives and gives birth to what he has been carrying inside him for ages. So she says that love is, among other things, the way in which people like birth what's inside their minds and souls into the exterior. If you buy that, I think it makes perfect sense that the melancholic should really need to connect with others in this way, more so than everyone, even though everyone needs this, as she says, given what we've seen about what's inside sort of the melancholic mind and soul. In a sense, the melancholic is full to a bursting point of the world inside their mind that they aren't ordinarily able to share with others. So in love, they come in close contact with another person, and they're theoretically able to express and externalize their inner world in the hopes of establishing a stable connection to the world which they previously felt that they had lost. And in a similar vein, in order to sort of birth what's inside them in a bid to a similar kind of reorientation, I think the melancholic might also exhibit like the second pattern of heated behavior we talked about, which is this intellect and artistic creation. I try not to make a habit of reading off of slides, but I will read these aloud so we can hopefully get a sense of what's going on in these descriptions. So the first one from, which is about Robert Lowell, he writes and revises translations with a kind of crooked brilliance and talks about himself in connection with Achilles, Alexander, Hart Crane, Hitler, and Christ, and breaks your heart. The second one, before your eyes, the man recited and sang himself in and out of madness. And the last, which is about Virginia Woolf, she talked almost without stopping for 2 or 3 days, paying no attention to anyone in the room or anything said to her. It was nearly all wildly insane. I think all of these quotes demonstrate slightly different lenses on the same thing, that the melancholic in question is projecting themselves outward onto, in the first case, historical figures and mythography, or onto the auditory space around them in the second two quotes. And they're doing so in order to kind of stabilize their internal world into the exterior. Actually, interestingly enough, Socrates is one of the foundational melancholic figures of the ancient Greek canon on this condition, and he was often characterized by his desire for solitude and silent contemplation. He had a reputation for just wandering into the woods and like thinking about philosophy for hours and hours on end, just alone. But there are also several sporadic recorded moments, including in the symposium, where he stays up all night drinking wine and essentially monologuing at the people around him about the philosophy and about the things that he's thinking. And I think this is, a slightly more obvious example of that urge to social reorientation, because Socrates was talking to people who were physically in front of him. But I think all of the crafts and the arts connected with the like quote unquote madness of the condition present a similar underlying desire, which is to self-express and to relieve that affective disjunction of melancholia by projecting the inner self out onto the exterior. So I'll just sum up here. In a moment of passion or lust or prolific creativity or even excessive conversation, the melancholic tries to express and externalize that sterile, arid world in which we've said they were previously totally alone. It's a sort of reconciliation of that like painful contrast that Jameson was talking about. And if they're successful, I would suggest that this would relieve the mourning that attaches to the melancholic condition. Of course, there is literature to suggest that it's impossible and that mourning is inherent to melancholia. Whether you buy that or not, I hope it's at least clear why such apparently different symptomatologies, isolation and silence versus talkativeness and high spirits, lust and affection versus art and music and writing and all of the things that are associated with melancholia, how that can all appear in the same condition. I've hoped to suggest a connection between the emotional mourning and melancholia and the social and intellectual signs that are often connected with the condition. Yeah, and I'll end here because I am excited to talk a little more about this with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Bella. That was fantastic, right, everyone? Yeah. So who has questions for Bella? Lauren, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. I really love your thinking about, in particular, sort of a creative instinct or an instinct for self-expression and a sense of grief. I mean, I think that's a really interesting connection to make with a lot of different different things you can pull out of it. What I'm curious about is sort of the way that you can report the condition of melancholia, because you talk about it as a condition, but you don't talk very much about the condition in regards to how it's identified. Like, is this something that's self-reported? Is this something that you would see a person and call them a melancholic person? Do you think there is almost perhaps a reverse relationship where you might be feeling loss or grief and then become melancholic rather than being melancholic and feeling grief because of it? I'm just curious what you think of that, about how one identifies themselves as melancholic and how that might change your ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Lauren. Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges of talking about, and again, I'll say condition very loosely, but talking about, let's say, a particular behavioral or sort of mental phenomenon that has been so long documented with so many different words and obviously translations. I mean, all of the things I was talking about have been translated to English. The Aristotle and the Avicenna were, from different parts of the world and things like that. I might be inclined toward something like self-reporting in the melancholic condition, partly because of precisely what you said, that it's difficult to define something that we now don't. When we say melancholia, we're not talking about a psychiatric definition. And so I don't think that it's something that really jives with the idea of like a psychiatric diagnosis or even a psychiatric self-diagnosis. So yeah, I would probably be inclined to say self-reported, even self-identified. Like I don't necessarily think of melancholia as something that is like a binary permanent condition of either you are a melancholic individual or not, which is the way the Greeks thought about it. But especially given the way that this is a sort of nebulous body of literature surrounding the condition and all of its relatives, yeah, I would incline towards self-reporting and thinking of it more as like phenomenological or even just a phenomenal description rather than something specific, and something specific that's either a yes, no, as I said. And really briefly to one of the last things you said about the possibility that there's a reverse relationship between like you feel grief, the affective grief or loss or mourning, and become melancholic. That's actually something that Freud brings up in that essay, Mourning and Melancholia. And he, again, a lot of this is a little bit vague, but he says some people will, they will grieve and then they will continue the way they were. Some people will grieve and then they become melancholic. So I don't know what precisely that says about like any permanence or any like psychiatric certainty to the condition. I definitely think that it exemplifies the fact that melancholia can appear, can disappear, can manifest, and that it is ultimately a fairly nebulous thing to try and identify. I hope that answered your question, partly at least.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe one more quick question, if anyone has anything else they want to ask. Yeah, Calvin.
Yeah, I don't know. Did you hear me from here?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I was curious about something earlier in the presentation. You described like mourning as, a process of like there's a hole in your life, right? There's like something missing there. And I've often heard of mourning as like trying to remap around something that's like disappeared in your life, whether that's a friend or like somebody died or you lost a hand or something. I don't know. But the weird thing about here is that the person, the subject or whoever is trying to remap because they've like lost touch with the world. So that's like really strange. What are they remapping there? I feel like there's some, like, it feels like it almost feels like an analogy, or it's a different type of thing entirely. But I'm like wondering what you view like the picture being there, like whether it's like mourning is a broader idea than just that. Anything like that, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I think if I've understood your question correctly, it's the question of like what is the melancholic mourning, or what could they be mourning if, right, that mourning might not be exactly what's occurring, but rather an analogy for what's occurring. I think that's fair. Obviously I'm still thinking about some of these things and working through them. The sort of provisional hypothesis here that is just me trying to figure this out, is that when the melancholic, and in some of the texts we saw that the melancholic is experiencing sort of one particular sort of reality, but they're perceiving the reality of others as something rich and, you know, vibrant, bright, beautiful, whatever it is you want to say. But that's something that, like, simply put, it feels like everyone else has and they don't. And I don't know if that's enough to say that that constitutes loss. But to me, looking at the literature, a lot of it seemed to suggest a feeling that's very similar to, you know, something was there and then it's not, the more traditional kind of loss that you were referring to of a person, or a, you know, Freud says homeland, liberty, something like that. Yeah, so to me, there is a semi-concrete, there is a concrete loss there. It's the world of others, it's the shared sociality, something that they feel like maybe they should be a part of, or they'd like to be a part of, but they aren't, or they can't be. And so there's that sort of impenetrable barrier of, there's something that's gone, there's something on the other side. There's something on the other side of like these walls of my reality that I can't access. So I think I don't know if this fully answers your question. To me, I think that that constitutes enough of a concrete loss that what's experienced is actual mourning. But if we have time, please feel free to follow up if that didn't answer your question.
No, I think that's great. That's like, it's a really interesting picture that you paint here. It's great. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much once again, Bella. Up next, we have Bora on Kierkegaard and Merleau-Ponty. So everyone get ready for a nice speech again.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. Is that good? I guess so. Uh, so today basically I'll be talking about Merleau-Ponty's book Phenomenology of Perception, and I will try to make it, keep it quick because I know we have time restraints. There's a lot to unpack. Um, I'm sorry for my slides in advance because they're not the most interesting, but the content is very interesting, and I will not be just reading off the slides. I'll be trying and actually explaining what's the importance of this paper. And so first of all, to do this, first I'll kind of introduce the text. The text is Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, and then here Merleau-Ponty's main aim in this text is to kind of show us, and he writes this during the existentialist movement. He's trying to show how the scientific, the objectivist approach to world, to understanding the world, kind of led to us leaving out the embodied subject out of the world, and it kind of reduced our thinking into objectifying thoughts of things, and he kind of tries to bring us back to the world almost with this text. That's why it is still regarded as although it's a very scientific text, it's also pretty much an existentialist text. And then to do this, it obviously relies on phenomenology founded by Husserl. And phenomenology is basically study of our experience as it is, rather than study of our experience after it is scientifically reduced, or from a objectifying perspective. It's just how we as subjects experience the world, and phenomenology kind of builds on that. And I'm bringing in Kierkegaard in this talk, as you can see in the section 4, because I think although Merleau-Ponty's project is very interesting in the text, I think he kind of runs into similar problems that he critiques earlier in the text, and I think Kierkegaard kind of, as another existentialist figure, comes into play there to help us see what he's kind of might be missing in this project, or what he's doing wrong in this project. And I will then be talking about how Kierkegaard's predictions could be right, because I present some parts in the text that in Merleau-Ponty that we find that rely on scientific thinking, which he critiques earlier, and that seemed to be actually not, that seemed to not stand the test of time. So that being said, so basically in the, as I mentioned in the work, Merleau-Ponty kind of investigates what Kierkegaard would call the objective thought, which is when you, for example, perceive something, the way it is kind of put these days is, well, the light beam goes, hits the blue cup, and then the cup has a determinate color, it's blue, and then your vision of it is just that light bouncing back to your eye, and there's this, in our generic understanding of our everyday world currently, we're pretty much mostly rely on these deterministic, scientific theories of explanation to understand phenomena occurring around us. And this is critiqued heavily by Merleau-Ponty. He gives a bunch of examples of how this is a limited view of viewing the world. For example, he takes us from Sartre. When you look at a red carpet, it it's so easy to just, when you look into it, to express that phenomena just by simply saying, oh, I'm seeing a red carpet. But once you see a red carpet in a phenomenological sense, and when you go back to your experience of experiencing the carpet, you're not necessarily standing against it and just, these light beams are hitting back to your eye from the red carpet. There's more than going on there in your exact experience of the carpet. The woolly carpet has almost a texture to it that has almost it has the wool. You hear the woolly feeling in it. You don't only see that, you also hear it. The sciences kind of unify in our phenomenological experience of the world. They're not just like these deterministic process, but there's this rather ambiguity surrounding the way we sense the world. And he kind of Merleau-Ponty's project is to kind of try and reflect on that exact experience of ours to explain what is going on in that experience, rather than just reflecting scientifically on that experience. And this is not to say the scientific reflection is wrong, or it's not good. It definitely is helpful, but it's also limited in what it can teach us about the experience. The study of experience itself is a different study, and he thinks we can do this through authentic reflection. So the thesis of my paper, though, is that Merleau-Ponty's authentic reflection, as we will see, is also unable to grasp our full experience of the carpet or any perception, because I think his reliance on I think this is because we can see a reliance on empirical studies from Merleau-Ponty that cause this authentic reflection to not be so much authentic. An analogy that I can form also is that that I formed is that so in the objective thought, we almost have the experience of the subject reduced. It's the science almost kind of takes as the objective as its starting point. For example, I give the example of the sheet music and versus just real music itself. In music, there's always more than what the sheet can capture. For example, if you're in a jazz club, at nighttime, drinking your iced tea, whatever you're drinking, there's that feeling in the room that's in the music. The experience of the music isn't just whatever is in front of the musical, whatever's written in the sheet of music that the players are looking at, right? There's maybe some instrument has a little that causes a different unorthodox sound in the music, but all of that experience of music, there's almost an there's almost an impossibility of recording that. There's an impossibility of objectifying the perception of that musical experience. And the science kind of starts with the sheet music, and it tries to explain to us world through this lens. And Merleau-Ponty thinks this is limiting because in this sense, science presupposes a deafness to the world almost, to universally explain itself. It kind of posits itself as it comes before the subjective experience, right? And however, the way it is that the subjective experience always has to come first. Music always has to come before sheet music. And if you are to explain the world as it is, we need to first explain music as it is, rather than trying to explain music through sheet of music. And this is where, as I said, Merleau-Ponty puts it as perception is not science, but rather classical science is a form of perception that has forgotten its origin, right? Science is founded on this, yet what it attempts to do is almost kind of explain what it's founded on. And the problem with that is if it's taken to be the absolute explanation of the world. So the phenomenal field emerges as the concrete antithesis to this reductionist view of the world, and it's a way of us kind of it's a field where we need to get rid of the objectivist categorized view of the world. It's almost our pre-reflective experience on the world. It's an experience of the world that is not yet disturbed by reflection. I mean, it's hard to really kind of put this into words, because and the phenomenologists will usually do this, where it's always noted that phenomenology is a descriptive philosophy rather than an explanatory one. I guess to explain phenomenal field, one thing I can use is from his text. He says, it will be necessary to awaken the experience of the world such as it appears to us insofar as we are in the world through our bodies, and insofar as we perceive the world with our bodies. And he's basically, when I read that, there's not much you can take from that unless you really almost do this you put the philosophical effort to reduce yourself into like experiencing the world as it is a phenomenal field. You need to almost it basically says you need to experience the world as it is, but I guess it kind of proves the point that when you kind of almost put it into words, it's not as strong. That he needs to do more descriptive tasks to kind of mean what he's saying. And he gives the example of the sky, which I really like. When you're looking in the sky, for example, at the beach on a sunny day, if you keep staring at the sky, it's not that the sky kind of stands over against you and you're, as we said, like the light beams, you hit the sky, the atoms in the sky, and they come back to you, and that sky is this like determinate abstract object. The real experience of the sky is a concrete one, where the subject is not like it's not that the subject and the object are necessarily separate. Like when you're perceiving the sky, when you're looking at the sky, you become the sky you experience. That's how he puts it. You have to be in the experience as the subject, right? And the sky is not a thing without you in that experience. You are the sky that you experience. And I think that's a very powerful way of putting the importance of the subjective field, the phenomenal field, or not the subjective field, but the phenomenal field, that the science kind of neglects or ignores. And the Kierkegaardian critique is the phenomenal field is pre-reflective, and any reflection disturbs the experience because it's external to experience. It's not in the experience. If I'm reflecting back to my experiencing of the sky, I am no longer the person, the subject that is experiencing the sky. Now when I reflected back on that experience, I have put myself as a subject, an abstract object, and the sky is, I kind of, when I reflect on it, I disturb the experience. Merleau-Ponty thinks there's a way we can, get rid of this. And he thinks we can do this in what he calls an authentic reflection, where we're aware that our reflection is limited, yet also we kind of try and go back to that experience, but realizing that in going back we're limited, because he's in a way he believes in the temporality of experience and believes that we can only fully experience something temporally as we are experiencing it. And but he thinks authentic reflection can actually get us closer to those experiences, and he thinks we can build almost an exact, he doesn't say that, but this is what Husserl would say, which he takes phenomenology from. Husserl would call phenomenology an exact science, because it explains our phenomena exactly as it is, exactly as we experience, rather than objectifying us. He kind of tries to create this idea where maybe the phenomenological philosophy can be the exact science, can capture what the science couldn't. And this is definitely a step forward, but I don't know my thing is I'm not sure in this paper how plausible it is that this is gonna be the absolute, like that this is gonna be an absolute understanding of our experience, especially considering that he takes this philosophical field, phenomenology, to be a verbal one. He thinks intersubjectively it will improve in time. So in the Hegelian philosophy, which is the one that Kierkegaard mainly critiques, there's this idea that gets actualized and universalized, and the way it happens is that it we're getting closer and closer as the society to basically these ideas that start to get actualized, and there's this like progression in philosophy according to Hegel. And Kierkegaard is a bit suspicious of this. He kind of thinks there are concepts and ideas like fate and love. Those are the two that he talks about, for example, that do not get further actualized. Like there are these subjective experiences, right? How can our subject how can you teach someone how to love, right? And he thinks that is like there's that subjective limitations almost, and he thinks there are ideas that cannot be objectified, similar to Merleau-Ponty, and he thinks we are, in certain senses, we are the idea that Hegel talks about. There is no this objective building of a progression of this idea. We are ourselves. We know. We kind of have our own subjective knowledge that is above this objective system. And the thing with Merleau-Ponty is he's actually very inspired by Hegel, and I think what he's trying to do is he's still kind of falling into the error of the scientific world, where he kind of still tries to build phenomenology as an intersubjecting field of philosophy. And what that means is he kind of wants to validate certain experiences as as more accurate than some that are not. And this could be considered fine, but I think the problem with this way of thinking is we need to realize that this can also never be the absolute, as Kierkegaard talks about, as Merleau-Ponty earlier in the text talks about. The subject always has to be in the absolute experience, right? And if you have an objective way of explaining the absolute world, you're kind of missing on something. And so Merleau-Ponty's account of the body is very important in this text, because as I said, his whole emphasis is on how all experiences are experienced by an embodied subject. And if you wanna, if we are talking about a subject, we in science we usually like neglect the importance of the body, because Merleau-Ponty talks about this, about how actually crucial our bodies are to the way we experience the world. He talks about, for example, a blind man with the cane, where the cane becomes a part of their body, and the perception of the world is totally different, right? And he thinks, these differences in our experience are heavily reliant on our body. And when we talk about our experiences, we cannot leave out our bodies. If we're talking about the subject, you have to have a body, embodied subject, not a disembodied one. And this is a very interesting idea, and obviously any subjectivist would probably agree with this. He takes this from Husserl's ideas book, the second one, and further develops it in this book. But the problem that he comes up to is he starts to talk about a thing called habitual body, and this habitual body he thinks is we all share it, and it's this universal body that exists in our pre-reflexive uh, you know experience of the world. And I'll get into those details. But then we have a modern critique, for example, that it's kind of insensitive for someone who pays so much attention to the subject to create this general body, and one wonders where did he kind of come up with this idea, right? And Merleau-Ponty kind of he always kind of comes back to this idea of authentic reflection, and it seems that his authentic reflection on the body is pretty much it's not that it's supposed to be a reflection on his experience, yet it seems that in this part of the text the habitual body is instead relied, the way it's established is relied on this scientific evidence that about how the body schema comes to being, because what he's trying to explain is that there's still an functional body before 6 to 12 months, but the self only kicks in at the 6 and 12 months period, and he thinks there has to be this general body that we all share, that has to that accounts for our experience before we have a self, before we have before we have our body schema. He thinks there has to be this pre-reflective body almost, and that's the habitual body. And current data obviously does not agree with this. I'm not saying the current scientific data is what we should be looking at. As I said, my whole critique is about how objectivist looking is limited. But my point here is to suggest that Merleau-Ponty kind of contradictorily relies on science in his authentic reflection, and it actually turns out that this reliance was when he kind of neglected his, okay, to rely on this experience, he did to come to this conclusion, he did not rely on his phenomenal field or his own experience of the world as it is, but he rather relied on the data about newborns, where there's no way of him experiencing that and drawing his knowledge from that experience. He has to rely on science here, and I think this kind of is a point in the text where we see him going further from his original idea that the objective view of the world limits us, and he starts to rely on it to create a subjective account. But then again, we see that being not accurate. And another example I give quickly is I actually think this is a very interesting one, the alien hand syndrome. So basically, the way another way Merleau-Ponty justifies for the habitual body is he talks about the example of the phantom limb, people who have maybe lost their limbs during the World War, when he was writing, in World War I, which was around when he was right after when World War I occurred, is when he was writing the book. And he kind of talks about how there was this when they're asked to, when people with phantom limb are asked to perform certain tasks, they do so, but they do so as if they have the missing limb still there, and he thinks that's because there's this general body. And I'm trying to look if, for example, he says the nexus between the habitual and the action body are broken when the phantom limb occurs. Hence, although the patient is able to perform certain habitual movements commanded at them, such as when a person is asked to touch their nose, that's a habitual movement, he thinks. But once they're asked but they're unable to answer to other requests, such as touching their nose with a ruler, which he thinks is not habitual. So he thinks there's this limitations around the habitual body, which encompass basic tasks such as touching the nose and all that stuff. And then and to prove that still is there, yet the actual body is not, but yet they still have a different body schema. The way he proves that is by showing that they cannot do more abstract, more complex tasks that are given to them. And in this case, basically, he tries to argue that there's this pre-reflective body, regardless if you're missing a limb, if you're a baby, that we all share, that causes us to act in a certain way in certain situations. Well, the example that kind of we know in our modern, and the normal example of that we know in our modern day that disagrees with this conclusion is the alien hand syndrome, where the subject has they consider their hand as not under the control of their mind, and that acts as a mind of its own. In this sense, the subject has a pre-reflective general body of the subject, which Merleau-Ponty would state is universal and non-changing, has a hand. Sorry, has another subject in their body that acts as a different for itself, as a different subject. So this is where we see there's no way such a thing can be general, right? And this is where we see how a pre-reflective body can have differences that cannot be generalized. So the habitual body cannot really exist. And that's kind of the conclusion is basically my summarization of the arguments. As we talked about, Merleau-Ponty kind of establishes this anti-science view, not anti-science, sorry, this anti-objectivist view where he thinks the objectivist view cannot ever absolutely explain the world. And then he gives this example of the phenomenal field, yet then he relies on an objectivist account to account for his body. And we see that actually ends up falling apart. And we see that kind of Kierkegaard's critique kind of being in effect still in Merleau-Ponty. And if you have any questions, I'm looking forward to them. I hope that was explained well.
Thank you so much, Bora. So who wants to start off with the question? Anyone? Someone's got to have something. Well, if not, you know what, Bora, I was wondering if you could take us through a little bit more of the difference between the phantom hand or the phantom limb and the alien hand syndrome, and how you see the second one going against this sort of pre-reflective habitual body idea.
Yeah, so the way I see the difference is that in the alien hand, you still the subject is, when they reflect on the hand, they realize it is their hand. But in the pre-reflective field, they still feel as if there's a stranger in their body. And the hand can do things such as, touching them on their knee, or like even strangling them, right? And it's a very terrifying thing. So in the phantom limb, what Merleau-Ponty argues is that you also have this pre-reflective body, yet even when you have a normal person, with all their limbs, and when you have someone with phantom limb, he thinks they still act in the same manner. Like once he asks, touch your nose, the phantom limb person almost has this pre-reflective response to like touch their nose in the same way that someone with a limb would, right? And he makes the case that this is because the phantom limb person still has their habitual body with them, which is the pre-reflective body that we all share. But yeah, as we talked about, in the alien hand, there's this definitely not general body going on in the pre-reflective realm, where you have someone feeling like they have a stranger in their body, right? Another conscious being. And once you have something like that, you cannot really generalize something. You cannot really generalize a pre-reflective body as existing for everyone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great. Any more questions for Bora? All right, well, thank you one more time for Bora. Up next, we're going to get a little mathy with Calvin with orders of worlds and type conditionalization this year in person. Thank you, Calvin.
Excellent. So this is orders of worlds and type conditionalization. What are orders of worlds and what is conditionalization? Those are a bunch of crazy words. I'm going to tell you what they mean. Before doing that, I'm going to explain a thought experiment which will make us understand why do we need to know what those are in the first place. This is. There we go. Okay, so hope all these work. Yeah, so suppose that you've volunteered yourself to science. You're in an experiment, not a thought experiment like a normal philosophy paper, but you're in a science experiment where the scientists are going to put you asleep on Sunday. But before they put you asleep, they say, we're going to flip a coin. If the coin comes up heads, then we will wake you up on Monday. If the coin comes up tails, we wake you up on Monday, and then we put you to sleep, and we wipe all of your memories of waking up on Monday, and then we wake you up again on Tuesday. So when you wake up on Monday, your experiences are going to be identical to whether you woke up on Monday or on Tuesday. So how strongly do you believe that the coin came up heads, given that you have these three different scenarios where you could have woken up? And then what is your degree of belief after you learn that it's Monday that you've woken up? How does it change? So to figure out what exactly it's going to look like is, that also looks weird. So to figure out what that looks like, I'm going to first describe what exactly doxastic worlds and doxastic alternatives are, which is how we are going to, which is on what we're going to assign our degrees of belief. Then we're going to learn how we update those beliefs given new evidence. Then I'm going to present a few solutions to the Sleeping Beauty thought experiment, which is what that was called. And they're going to look weird. So then I'm going to present a different type of conditionalization called type conditionalization, which is probably, maybe, going to give better results. And then I'm going to cover some objections, very good objections to this different kind of conditionalization. So the difference between doxastic worlds and doxastic alternatives is going to be just the difference between possible worlds and centered worlds, if you know what those are. A possible world or a doxastic world is just a way that things could be, or a way that I know the world could be. I know that I live in the world where Thelonious Monk played the piano. I know that I could have lived in the world where Thelonious Monk played the tuba. That would have been a different state of affairs, and so that would have been a different possible world and a different doxastic world. A centered world, on the other hand, it's not a world. It's not really a way that things could be. It's more a perspective at a possible world, and it's identified by an individual at that world, a time at that world, and the world that it has to be at. So one centered world my centered world right now is me right now. What is it? About between 3 and 4 o'clock, April 26th. A different center would be me in the year 2022. I don't know, in Scotland doing God knows what. A different centered world would be right now, and I don't know, Timothy Williamson, wherever he is. And yeah, so graphically, a centered world, a possible world, you can visualize them like this. These are all like possible worlds. There's one where Timothy Williamson was president, Richard Nixon was a dog in one of them. There are all sorts of these things. But how we identify which possible world we're at, we start eliminating the possible worlds that we know that we don't exist at. So here are all our possible worlds. These are our doxastic worlds. And we learn that Richard Nixon is not a dog. Then we say, okay, I don't exist at any of the worlds where Richard Nixon is a dog. So all the worlds that are not fine, cut those out. And then we also learn, Jesse Ventura isn't going to win the presidency. So we don't live in any of those possible worlds either. So we keep doing that until we figure out what exact possible world we're at. And similarly, we can do so for centered worlds, which are just going to take place within whatever possible world we exist at. That's a bit easier because it's a bit easier to know what individual you are and what time it is. So how do we describe our beliefs in that I exist at a particular doxastic world or doxastic alternative? We're going to do that. We're going to call that a credence. A credence is going to be my degree of belief in me being at a particular doxastic world or doxastic alternative. And it's going to be some decimal number between 0 and 1. And the sum of all of the possible alternatives I could be at, or that I think I could be at, is going to be 1. And my priors are going to be my credences before I receive any evidence. So it's just going to be my default belief that I'm in any of these worlds. And piece of evidence that contributes to my belief is that's evidence. We don't need any fancy definitions for everything. So when we're updating our credences, we're going to mainly look at the first 2 of these steps. All that we're going to do is we're going to find some evidence that's going to somehow influence our belief state. And we first set all of the alternatives incompatible with our evidence to 0. Then the sum of all of them is going to be less than 1. So we need to normalize our credences and all the other alternatives that remain so that they sum to 1. How does that look? Like this. We can start off by thinking I'm in like 3 possible hypothetical scenarios, H1 through H3. And then I have this evidence, and the evidence says you're not in H1. And as before, I had my credence was distributed evenly among all 3 of them. But since I eliminate H1, I could only be in these 2. So my credences are normalized to 1/2 for each of them. So for example, if I'm drawing a king, like if I'm drawing a card from a deck of cards, my credence in selecting a king of hearts should be 1/54. 54 cards in a deck, 1 king of hearts, makes sense. Then I gain some evidence that says that, math bad, that's wrong. Suppose that I gain some evidence that says that the card is definitely going to be a king. In that case, the credence, my credence in selecting the card that's a king is going to be 1/13. And I can set all of my credences and all the other alternatives that are not a card being a king to 0. So when I normalize that, it comes out to not that, it comes out to 1/4. So I should be confident that my confidence should be 1/4 that the card is going to be a king of hearts. So here's our first solution to the Sleeping Beauty thought experiment from Adam Elga, who I think first posed it. He says that on Sunday, of course, you split your credences evenly. You have a 1/2 credence in heads. And then on Tuesday, since you have these 3 alternatives between Monday and heads, Monday and tails, and Tuesday and tails, you distribute that evenly among all these 3 alternatives. Then when you learn that it's Monday, you set your credence in Tuesday and tails to 0, and you normalize the rest of them so that they are 1/2 and 1/2 again. There's dispute as to whether your credence in the coin coming up heads at the start is actually 1/3, reasonably so. There are other solutions, such as David Lewis's, which we don't have the time to get into, but it's really cool. You might not find it cool. But that's not the end of the story, because people still disagree with either of these solutions. Christopher Meacham, in particular, notices that they share one thing in common, which leads them both to the same conclusion. He says they both do something called centered conditionalization. That is, they conditionalize only on the centered worlds or the doxastic alternatives. There's only one level of conditionalization going on, and that's because they're treating all of the doxastic worlds and doxastic alternatives as the same type of thing. Christopher Meacham then says, instead, we can distinguish between doxastic worlds and doxastic alternatives and do 2 levels of conditionalization, so to speak. What we do is we first conditionalize on the doxastic worlds by doing all our normal conditionalization stuff at the doxastic worlds. Then we do the centered worlds or the doxastic alternatives, except when we normalize our credences, they have to sum to our credence in whatever the doxastic world is at which they possibly obtain. So how does this work for Sleeping Beauty? What happens here is, of course, we start off with 1/2 for each of them, but all the way throughout, until we get our evidence, it's going to go like this. We have one doxastic alternative at the world where the coin comes up heads. That's the world where it's heads and you're in a Monday. However, for the tails world, there are two doxastic alternatives, Monday and Tuesday. So your credence between those two is divided evenly to 1/4. But when you learn that it's not Tuesday, you update your credences. But you need to only update your credences for the doxastic alternatives at the tails world. And once you do that, you get back to 1/2 and 1/2. Aha, genius. Except for when it's not. So here is the place where it can get weird. Take the Sleeping Beauty thought experiment, except with a little bit of a change. Suppose that in this experiment, they say, all right, so what we're doing this time is we're going to flip the coin, and if it comes up heads, then we're going to wake you up. We're going to flip the coin again. And that flip is going to determine whether you wake up in a black room or a white room on Monday. But if the coin comes up tails, then we're just going to wake you up in a black room on Monday and a white room on Tuesday. And this is what that looks like. So if you wake up and you're in a white room, then you're going to have to update your credences. But the thing is, we only need to update the doxastic alternatives at the tails world. So the tails world goes unaffected. Our credence in that doesn't go down any. But we need to update on the heads doxastic world, meaning that the possibility that our credence in heads actually coming up is going to decrease relative to the tails world. So then we're going to come out with a credence in heads being 1/3, and in tails being 2/3. And that's weird. So what we instead can do is we can try to find some way to at least be consistent. And here's what I do to make it consistent. So we're going to define something called a limbic world. A limbic world is going to be a world whose existence depends on another world. A body world is going to be some world on which some other possible world depends, or a doxastic alternative. And we're going to call those, we can call those like, frame those in like several different terms. We can call them ordered worlds, like body world might be a first order world, a limbic world might be a second ordered world. And you can like kind of branch them out and go down from there, but it's not important. We just need to mention that so that the title makes sense. So here's how the Sleeping Beauty thought experiment gets handled with, or the black and white room thought experiment goes with type conditionalization. In this case, you just update both of your limbic worlds the same way, and those go from 1/4, 1/4, and 1/4, 1/4 to both being 1/2, and you get the exact result that we would have wanted if we wanted the same results that Christopher Meacham got. So great, that was like pretty easy, right? It's not, it never really is. There are two objections, like main objections, really. The first one is like, what exactly are these body worlds and these limbic worlds? Because there's like several ways that you could formulate this. Maybe it would work, but they're like really mysterious. And how do you differentiate them? It could be difficult for us to differentiate which one is a limbic world and which one is a body world. In that case, we might just say that a limbic world it might just depend, like its existence would depend on the body world, but that might have something to do with causality, or it might have something to do with temporality. It doesn't generally matter. It mostly depends on the circumstances or whatever you're using it for. On the other hand, if you're asking what exactly metaphysically a body world and a limbic world are, that gets weird because you could identify a body world as a set of possible worlds, in which case there's some math that needs to be done and some metaphysics that needs to be worked out. But it could also just itself be a body, like a possible world, and we organize everything else accordingly. I don't think this is much of a problem. It just requires some metaphysics to work out. But what if we can come up with a better, like another thought experiment that says this also goes weird? Yeah, it turns out we can do that. So suppose that we have the black room, white room thought experiment, except we change some things. If the coin comes up heads, then you wake up in a room with 3 red walls. If tails, then you wake up in a room with 3 blue walls. Then you roll a die to determine what the color of the last wall is going to be. So if you're in the mostly red room, die is going to say you could, the last wall could be any of red, blue, gold, black, periwinkle, or white. If you're in the blue room, the roll of the die will determine whether the last wall is blue, gold, black, white, periwinkle, or coral. What exactly those colors are doesn't matter, but see what happens if you wake up in a room where you see a blue wall. The first thing you see is a blue wall. In that case, there's only one limbic wall remaining where you're in a mostly red room where heads was flipped. But in the blue room, there are 6 alternatives that remain in the tails world. However, due to type conditionalization, you're still going to say that either one has a 1/2. We have a 1/2 credence in either one. But this seems like an obvious case where we should have a 1/7 credence that the coin has come up heads. So what do we ought to make of this? I mean, it seems like what we're saying, it seems like in this case, this just forces us to say our intuitions have to go one way or the other. And if we're going to follow Christopher Meacham's logic that the coin flip should come up 1/2 no matter what, because that's a change in doxastic worlds, it seems like we might want to give up a distinction between doxastic worlds and doxastic alternatives. Generally, it's going to depend on what intuitions you're willing to give up. But that's all that I have for right now. I don't have any more time. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Calvin. Does anyone have any questions for Calvin? Oh, come on, there's got to be one.
I still have questions myself.
Yeah. So maybe if you have a minute, do you want to get into some of those metaphysics of the limbic and body worlds for us? Or is
Oh,
that
God, no, but
yeah?
I do have another couple of slides.
All right, let's hear that.
One of them is these are just like, this is a further like way that you can like make Christopher Meacham's like compartmentalized conditionalization weird. He comes up with this thought experiment where you have say you have like you have like two doxastic worlds that you could possibly be in. One is a normal world and one is a strange where nothing weird is going on, and another one is a strange world where there's a scientist creating like a ton of brains in vats with experiences that are like identical to yours. And you have like a ton of different subjective experiences that could happen in the next second. You could be like, you could see like a dog chasing its tail. You could be eating ice cream or something. But there are like a ton of different alternatives, doxastic alternatives that you have. But at this, or there are a bunch of different doxastic worlds that could be. But for Christopher Meacham's, no, I'm sorry, but for these brains and vats, they're only going to have like one subjective experience, and like say they're all going to have the experience of a dog chasing its tail. In that case, like you have all of these different doxastic worlds, and when in the next second, when you don't experience any of these doxastic worlds, but you experience the dog chasing its tail, that's going to be the only doxastic world that remains. And then for the world where there are brains and vats being created, all of those doxastic worlds are going to remain. So you end up like with a tremendously high credence in being in a strange world. Don't mind those equations over there. I think they're wrong. You have a tremendously high credence in being in a strange world where brains and vats are being created, but an incredibly small credence in being in a normal world where there aren't brains and vats being created. So if it wasn't counterintuitive to you before, then like hopefully that made it seem weirder. Just have to throw brains and vats into the next to make things weird.
Thank you, Calvin. Okay, so for our last undergraduate presenter, we have Zuha with On Loving the Unknowable.
Hello everyone, my name is Zuha. I'm from St. Kate's. I just graduated with a bachelor's of psychology with a minor in philosophy, and this is my paper on loving the unknowable. And this was written for a class last semester, which was called Emotions as Tools for Resistance. And what really started this inquiry was Bell Hook's book, All About Love. Right, go to the next. Oh, okay. So my thesis for this paper was that the basis of love is accepting our limits in knowledge about ourselves and those we love. And I will delve more into what that means. So before we do delve into that, we need to understand how we define love. And Bell Hooks jumps straight into this in her first chapter called Charity, Clarity, Give Love Words. And her argument is that we really should be strictly defining love, because when people have different definitions of what love is, that makes it so that the term can be used or misattributed or abused. People can say they love you, but they can hurt you, or they can love you in ways that really she thinks should not be included in the definition of what love is. However, I personally disagree with her. I think that a strict definition of love has a few problems. First and foremost, when we have a strict definition of what love is, it bars some people from love. An example that I think about in my paper is people who are considered neurodivergent. Particular example being individuals who have a more stigmatized disorder like narcissistic personality disorder, who may treat people more kindly because they're seeking a supply of validation. Now, this kind treatment might be considered a loving action, but some people may debate if it actually is love because the person's intentions are not considered within the norms of love that some people might identify. And so I would implore us to consider that when there is divergence in neurology, perhaps there may be also divergence in how love may be practiced and engaged with. And additionally, strictly defining love can be a bit challenging because it's impractical. When it comes to emotions, we as a society really struggle to define what really any particular emotion is, to have an agreement on it. And even right now, me and Hooks are going to be debating if love is an action or an emotion. Societally, most people think love is an emotion, but Hooks argues that it should be an action, a verb. And so even the fact that there is a dissonance on whether it's an action or an emotion, what makes it up, makes it so that defining it and having an agreed upon definition for everyone to utilize is actually quite challenging. So let's delve a little bit more into the actual book after the first chapter. Bell Hooks does describe in passing components of love, which are taken from psychologist Erich Fromm. And those components of love are knowledge, respect, responsibility, and care. And Hooks and I do have different names for these constructs. Like I would also say that knowledge, respect, and responsibility and care are important to having a healthy relationship. I wouldn't say that they're integral to love. I would say that, yeah, maybe people could feel love for each other in a relationship, but for the relationship to work, they need these components. Hooks would say, if they don't have these components, they're not in love. But I think this is kind of a semantic disagreement, and she and I can still be in discussion with one another because we technically agree that these components are important to like a healthy ethical relationship, regardless of whether or not we think it is love or not, as I just said. So now we kind of bridge into an introduction to existential philosophy, because I'm going to be bringing up Simone de Beauvoir's ethic of reciprocity to kind of negotiate Hooks' ideas. And this will make more sense as I go along. So first and foremost, in existential philosophy, there are subjects and others. And what this means is that subjects are perceivers of a world, not a word, made up of objects. So each of us is perceiving the world currently, and we are our own subjects. We're kind of like the main character. And others are objects. So for example, my friend Mara is an other or an object. I perceive her, but I can never have access to her subjectivity. So awareness of another subjectivity fuels a drive to kill the other. This is something that's discussed pretty extensively in existential philosophy. What happens is sometimes when people start to recognize that someone outside of them is not only an other, but a subject just like themselves, it starts to suggest the idea that they themselves might be an other. So I can use my friend as an example. If I start to recognize that she's a subject, that means she thinks I'm an other. That can be uncomfortable because I'm like, but I'm the perceiver. She's not, but she is. And so recognizing the subjectivity and the other reveals the possibility of oneself being an object, like I just mentioned. And to preserve our sense of subjectivity, we may seek to kill the other, sorry. So this brings us onto the subject of subjectivity and otherhood in romantic relationships in particular. And so sometimes what can happen in a romantic relationship in order to resolve this conflict between the subject and the other is immolating the self through creating a unified self. And so what that means is that through like consistent forms of union, like sharing ideas, sharing information about their days, really living together, people will start to kind of be like, oh, well, we have a shared self. We have the same ideas, we kind of share a life together. We together are one subject. But it's a misguided solution because what it does is it actually seeks to be kind of a roundabout way of killing the other and then killing ourselves at the same time. A philosopher that really delves into Beauvoir's like concept of ethic of reciprocity and these concerns is Ellie Anderson. And one thing she explains from Beauvoir is that there seems to be an unequal immolation of the self between men and women in romantic relationships. And I might argue that this may be more common in like traditional relationships or more so in the past, but it's still a pertinent consideration. So women in traditional heterosexual relationships may be more prone or often thinking of our future, our ideas, than men in heterosexual relationships. But how this can show up in an interesting way is that men in these relationships may fail to recognize the level of de-autonomization that women experience as a result of this, because men also will still be losing part of their autonomy, their self, through that unification process, but they still may preserve some of it. They may still think of my career or kind of have some of these individual ideas. So they still lose some of themselves, but maybe not to the same degree. And so it's like, why do you have a problem? I have a problem too, and I'm not making a big deal out of it. So that can be that's my possible suggestion of an interpretation of this phenomenon between dissonance, like in men and women understanding each other in romantic relationships when there's that imbalance. So Simone de Beauvoir's ethic of reciprocity. So some important definitions. There's epistemic opacity, which is lacking information about ourselves and our functioning. And I'm going to explain why this is pertinent to this discussion in a second. There's otherness to oneself. So like I said, we're subjects, but we're actually also objects to ourselves. We do perceive ourselves. And then this leads up to the impossibility of epistemic transparency. So something that Anderson makes clear when discussing Simone de Beauvoir's work is that a part of the reason why it's difficult to have a unified self also is because epistemic transparency is not possible. We can't be fully transparent with another about who we are because we are others to ourselves. We have epistemic opacity. We don't have full knowledge about ourselves. So how can we be transparent about it? Additionally, we also have revelations through being perceived by another. So that also kind of clarifies or further establishes the fact that we don't have full access to our knowledge about ourselves. And so essentially, Beauvoir's concept of love is that when the practice of love is recognizing the otherness of the otherness of ourselves, and the otherness of the other within him or herself, as well as their subjectivity. And so you're recognizing all these things at one time, and I will explain why that is pertinent. So let's come back to hooks for a second, because the reason why I said all this stuff about Beauvoir is because it brings clarification to Hooke's ideas. Hooke talks about how justice is seeing the world as the way it is rather than the way we want it to be. But Beauvoir says that we really can't truly know someone. So can we really see the world? And I would argue that taking a Beauvoirian approach to what Hooks is talking about is actually seeing the world as it is, in the sense that we see the world as what we do not know. We recognize that there's things we don't, that we don't have access to knowledge-wise. And how this has implications for how we act towards others, for an ethical relationship, for an ethical practice of love, is that we should not act for others, but rather accept responsibility for how our actions create the conditions that others respond to. And what that means is, like I said, you cannot be the subject someone else is. You just can't act for them. But you can hold yourself responsible for shaping the world that the other perceives through their own subjectivity. So everyone is responding and reacting to the world as subjects. And so we, as our own subjects, can be like, yes, like my actions will impact the world that this person lives in, but I can't make them act in a way. I can change the world that they act to. And I'm part of that world, so. And how this connects back to something Hooks talks about is that concept of emotional estrangement. She talks about how men become estranged from their feelings, and that leads to an inability to assume responsibility for causing pain to others. What that means is, like, she talks about how they might disregard their feelings, might be like, hey, I don't actually feel angry right now, or I'm not sad. And why it's a way to actually gain power, because then you can claim reality is whatever you would prefer it to be than rather what it is for yourself in reality as an object. And so you can be like, no, I'm not angry. I'm perfectly fine. Actually, we have a unified self, and I feel like the same thing that we both feel together right now, actually. And what that can result in is a form of de-autonomization. And that's how it works as a power tactic in a way. And so intentional emotional estrangement, it can be a case of killing the other through unifying selves. It is an act of oppression. And contributing to an extreme form of, it contributes to an extreme form of responsibility that lacks respect. Because when someone is disregarding their emotions for the purpose of, like, acting for a family unit, like a patriarch who's like, I actually am not stressed out at all because I exist for the purpose of this family and I'm acting for us. It starts to diminish the respect of the individuals who are part of that family unit, because it is not acknowledging how the individual is impacting their lives, because they ignore it to create a reality, a shared reality that they have as a unified self. Like I said. Okay, so now that we've, like, established, like, okay, unified self is like a problem, maybe try not to do that, and so on and so forth. How much of this is really a choice? Like, is love a choice? Is loving action a choice? Hooks talks about soul connections versus love as an action, right? Like I said, she thinks love is an action, but then at the end of her book, she starts talking about soul connections. And a lot of people get pretty confused when they see that. And how I worked on understanding or reconciling these two concepts she brings up is that she talks about soul connection as a way, like, sometimes we find someone, we might not even really like them, but we feel like we have a soul connection with them. And how I reconcile these concepts is that she's saying that we can't love anybody. Like, some people we have an involuntary soul connection with, but we can also choose to love nobody. You could have an involuntary soul connection with someone, but then you go, never mind, I don't want love. Sorry, not you, directed at you, of course not. And so that's how I reconcile those two concepts. And then considering what Beauvoir says is actually really accentuates this idea, because it's almost like there's two layers to love. First is the one that Hooks established, an involuntary soul connection. And for Beauvoir, that would be an involuntary recognition of the subjectivity of the other, which is terrifying. And then the second layer is not seeking to kill the other. And that's the choice. That's the choice you make. So yes, in conclusion, we can't speak about love without agreeing on the same definition. I just demonstrated it. Hooks values interacting with the world as we know, but Beauvoir values interacting with the world as we do not know it. And an ethical practice of love is really based upon recognizing the subjectivity of the other, the otherness in ourselves, and the otherness in the other, and choosing not to kill the other, knowing it all. So that's it.
Hey, thank you, Zuha. Does anyone have any questions? Lauren, you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I think, especially in the first half of your presentation, when you're talking a lot about hooks, we do seem to have a focus on heteronormative romantic relationships. But of course, not all the concepts you're talking about are like exclusive to that situation. I wonder what you think about the dynamics that you're expressing here in love, and in particular, sort of like this assumption of the other under, or of yourself under the other, or sort of this killing of the other. Do you think that those dynamics are significantly changed if you're talking about familial or platonic love? Or do you think that there are essentially the same dynamics except maybe recognized differently? Or do you think maybe they just function a little bit differently in relationships that aren't partnerships, like committed romantic partnerships?
Yes, thank you. I think that the conflict of the subject and the other can exist like in any relationship because everyone has a sense of subjectivity and everyone is perceiving each other as others. But I think the way it's coped with can be different. Where I think commonly we view romantic relationships and partnerships where people like to believe that they'll form a unified self. And same also applies to some degree to family units, but less so to platonic relationships. And so I think I do wonder if that conflict becomes apparent in platonic relationships as often, or if it's dealt with in a different way. But platonic relationships don't tend to have that sense of like unifying that exists in familial and romantic relationships as much. So I think that's something that would be different, but I can't say exactly how. Yes.
More questions?
Yeah, I have one. So in the beginning, and a little bit throughout, you talk about this desire to kill the other, that naturally arises out of recognizing yourself as other through their subjectivity. And I'm curious, I think for a lot of people, it might not be immediately obvious that we have that desire. I think a lot of people might say, I've never experienced the feeling of wanting to kill someone else just because they make me feel like another. So I'm just curious how you might respond to an objection like that.
So, I don't know if the person who would object is talking about literal homicide. To which I would say, that's not what I'm talking about either. But to be more specific, I guess to the actual like analogy, I guess would be that their urge is not fully apparent. It's like a way of trying to deal with the problem, so to speak. Like even in the example that I bring up of romantic relationships, that seeking of the unification of the self is a form of killing of the other self and one's own self. But nobody's thinking that they're doing something malicious or diminishing someone's individual nature. No. So I would say that you may not be aware of it. Perhaps you've done a good job and you've managed to recognize the otherness of the other and all the things that Beauvoir says. Or maybe you're not aware of it and it might be good to reflect on it. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if we don't have any more, then I've got one. This might be a little out of the scope of your project, but when you were talking about creating the conditions for others to act in as opposed to acting for them, and we're also kind of from looking at things from this perspective where there is an inherent difference between ourselves as a subject and other people as a subject. How do you think we should go about deciding on how our actions are going to affect those others as their own individual subjects? Are we going off of, say, their testimony? Are we trying to universalize our own experiences? Is there something else you might think of?
Okay, yeah, I have a few thoughts. I have been thinking about how one could practically apply the concepts of the paper. And I would say, I think it's like a mix. So for one, yes, testimony is obviously beneficial, but it's also established that people don't have, are epistemically opaque, so they won't necessarily be able to testify to it. So that can be one avenue, and then one's own experience and awareness can also be beneficial. But I think what I really think of when I originally read the idea of not acting for others and instead impacting the world is actually The idea is not specifically in relation to interpersonal relationships, but it can be applied. I think of systemic change more so. So leaving the realm of like romance and interpersonal relationships, I think of like, you know, when someone's complaining about the way some people are acting in the world. Like, okay, for example, I hear lots of people complain about homeless people. They're like, well, they should, you know, do better, right? But just saying do better is kind of like you're trying to be the subject. Say, just do what I would do. Whereas if you actually wanted to, if you took responsibility for how your actions create the conditions you respond to, would be systemic change. So that would be like the most like conventional application of that idea, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Let's hear it one more time for Zuha. Okay, finally, last but not least, we have some good home Minnesota philosophy of science from our very own professor, Alan Love.
So thank you for the invitation to be here. What I wanted to talk about this afternoon is some work that I've been doing over the last few years as a part of a large grant project. And so a part of it is joint work with postdoc Max Strezow, who was a PhD student also here in the department. Basically this involves thinking about some pretty old issues in the sense that they go back to antiquity, but actually have relevance for the kind of heart of ongoing scientific investigation. So David Haig is a Harvard biologist, and in a recent book, he said, "I was repeatedly warned against teleological thinking by lecturers who spoke of the heart as a pump for the circulation of blood, and of RNAs as messengers for the translation of proteins. Concepts of purpose and function shape the practice of biology. This is the natural way to think about living things, but the overt language of teleology is censored." Some of you may have experienced this, even in taking introductory biology classes. This language is common, and yet if you say the T word, people might get upset. And J.B.S. Haldane captured this early in the 20th century when he said, "Teleology is like a mistress to a biologist. He cannot live without her, but he's unwilling to be seen with her in public." The idea is that somehow this is absolutely crucial to doing the work, and yet you can't admit it. In fact, there's some nice work thinking about this phrase and how it originated in the 20th century. But the bottom line is there's a kind of challenge that teleology brings to contemporary science, and it's the following. Although biologists often use descriptive language that imputes purposiveness to living systems, many have argued that these conceptions are at best heuristic and at worst egregious errors. However, there's growing recognition that biological phenomena which suggest agency, directionality, or goal-directedness demand new conceptual frameworks that can translate into rigorous theoretical models and discriminating empirical tests. So you can think about this as sort of saying, look, we need to bring the teleology out into the open. We're actually going to deal with it and understand it empirically in the context of the sciences. And yet, we have to recognize that there's a kind of fear about doing that, kind of worry that somehow this is not quite legitimate. So I'm not going to talk about the project itself, but if you're interested, this is the big project, and the website for it sort of shows different sub-awards around the world that are actually trying to do some of the scientific work. What I'm going to do today is just kind of share with you a little bit of my perspective on how you meet that teleology challenge in a certain way. So we start from a place that I think is important to acknowledge, which is that philosophical analyses have shown that reasoning about purposes in living systems can be epistemically respectable. So there's now consensus, this is okay. You can do this and not trip the wire. Right? But what's been missing from the philosophical analyses to date is to actually better understand the aims and commitments that motivate scientific inquiry into purposive phenomena. So what I'll do in the presentation is analyze two recent accounts of teleology and biology to uncover presuppositions about the way the boundary between system and environment is described, how part wholes are set up and decomposed, and the timescales that are relevant for the phenomenon of purposiveness that biologists would be interested in. And the key takeaway message is that instead of thinking of these as kind of metaphysics, what teleology is, in fact, what we're doing is a kind of modeling, and therefore we find ourselves making different modeling choices in order to understand the empirical phenomena. The resulting precision from this kind of philosophical analysis actually implies that some traditional controversies that are in philosophical literature and to some degree in the biological literature can actually be navigated around, and we can make some progress in the sciences as a consequence of that. So not what is teleology, but how are purposive phenomena characterized and explained, moving past what Max and I have called teleophobia, right? Kind of moving past that point where you're just scared of even talking about it and getting to a place where you can actually see it as a profitable tool. So let's start with a concrete example so that we sort of are grounded, right? The broken wing display. Some of you may be familiar with the broken wing display. It's described in lots of nature shows, right? It's when a bird is caring for its young, right? And there's a predator nearby, and the bird will then fake that they have a broken wing and draw the predator away from the nest because the predator thinks injured animal, easier to eat, right? And then follows the parent away from the nest. Okay. So we've got a behavior. The behavior seems to be very goal-directed, right? That is, there's intentional deception of some kind going on to draw the predator away from the nest. Now, this would be interesting if it just happened once, right? But what's fascinating is that it's happened over and over again in the history of birds, right? So this is a complex phylogeny. The only thing you need to pay attention to is the scattering of red, because the scattering of red shows you how many times the broken wing display has evolved over and over and over again. So there's something about the broken wing display that plays a role such that it is happening multiple times evolutionarily, as opposed to just being a one-off. Okay. Now, one question you might ask, and the way I just framed it was, what's the purpose of the behavior? And that's actually what most philosophers have in mind when they think about teleology. What is the function of the trait? What is the function of engaging in a broken wing display? So, article from about 2 decades ago, Modern Philosophical Resurrection of Teleology, sort of adopts this kind of standpoint, kind of represents that orientation. But actually, that's not the only thing that you might think about, right? Because notice that that's a focus on a trait, right? But you actually might be interested in the whole bird, right? As an organism, right? And the organism engaging in goal-directed behavior, of which the broken wing display would just be one, right? And that actually brings us into a long tradition in the history of philosophy, from Aristotle up through Kant and others, who saw organisms as intrinsically purposive, right? They're autonomous, they're goal-directed, they're self-maintaining agents. That's what it means to say you have an organism, as opposed to something that's not alive, right? It's got all these properties. And so if we only treat it as a function of a trait, we're kind of missing some of this broader discussion that goes back in time. And so we can think about that question as, what kind of a thing must a system be to engage in this behavior? That is, to engage in goal-directed behavior of the kind we see in the broken wing display, right? What attributes must a system have to evolve such behavior? Is there agency involved? What does that consist in? Does it actually have a representation of a goal? Because the moment you start thinking about the bird has a goal, then you start thinking, well, what does that mean? Right? We don't think that the bird is like reflecting on, the predator in the way that we would, without the same cognitive capacities. But at the same time, it would be silly to say the bird's just acting completely out of instinct, right? It seems like that's too cheap of a way out of thinking about this. And so you would ask those sorts of questions to try and understand the system. So questions like these steer us towards a wider space of possibilities in considering biological teleology and its empirical expressions. And the goal here is to recover a richer framework for these discussions that has these sorts of implications for biological practice. So in thinking about the philosophy of science work that I do, one of the concerns I have is that I don't just analyze the science philosophically, but that those analyses actually have some kind of consequence or payoff for the way scientists continue to pursue their work. Okay. So in what remains, I want to do just a couple things. I want to talk about these recent accounts of biological teleology, show what happens when we shift them into the modeling framework, and then their scientific payoffs before concluding. Okay. So I'm going to do two recent accounts of biological teleology. Okay. And two distinctions are crucial for that. One is the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic teleology, and another is between static and dynamic teleology. So let's try and unpack those a little bit together. So teleology is intrinsic if purposes arise from some set of properties or relations internal to a system. So we just referred to Aristotle as well as Kant. This is what they have in view when they think of a system as intrinsically purposive. That is, the purposiveness is not something that requires something outside of the organism, right? But rather something that's constitutive of what it means to be that kind of organism. Each animal has needs that determine what is good for it in relation to its way of life. These needs are related to the kind of thing that animal is, which in turn explains why it has the parts and undergoes the changes it does, right? And that's an idea with a long career in life sciences, right? The one that kind of makes sense intuitively as well, right? So if you think about why does the tiger have sharp claws and sharp teeth? It's in order to be able to catch prey, to eat, because it needs to eat to survive, right? So we kind of have that chain of logic for, why are there particular properties? The particular properties are not there on their own. They're for the sake of the organism. Okay. Teleology is extrinsic if purposes manifest as a consequence of properties or relations external to the system. So Plato is actually our kind of Greek antiquity representation of this, right? So why does a system have the property it does? Well, it's been given that property from the outside by something else, right? Typically, some kind of designer is oftentimes in view in this sort of antique. So in Plato's Timaeus, right, we get this sort of story. The teleology as extrinsic view is also what we typically associate with natural theology, right? So somehow I would be able to infer the existence of a deity from saying, well, why does that part do the thing it does? Well, it was designed to do that thing, right? And so we see that especially in the early modern period, a lot of the natural theology there is like that. But it's not just theology, but it's actually also in evolutionary biology, because you can argue that in Darwin's theory, what confers purposes is actually natural selection, because selection is building in the sharpness of the claws, right, over time to give you those properties. So it's a naturalistic explanation, but it's still an extrinsic one, right, not an intrinsic one. Now the other distinction, static versus dynamic. This comes out of the systems thinker Bertalanffy in the mid-20th century. He distinguished two types of teleology, a static one that involves arrangements that seem to be useful for a certain purpose, and a dynamic one that seems to involve directiveness of process, right? So the static teleology aligns with kind of what we already saw, an eteleological understanding of function. Some trait X exists because it does Y. Translate that. Notice that this is agnostic about the intrinsic extrinsic distinction, right? Because you could argue that the X exists because it was put from the outside or because it's intrinsic to that, right? So it's the cross-cutting distinctions. And then dynamic teleology is heterogeneous. It includes phenomena like goal-directedness, various forms of regulation, and sometimes what's called true finality or purposiveness, meaning behaviors guided by an explicitly represented goal state. Right? So part of why that's a more heterogeneous category is because you think less about a specific match between a part and a function, right? So sharp teeth, grasp, right? As opposed to the ability to plan and play badminton, chess, and all these other sorts of things where there's not this determinative match between, oh, the brain we have is a chess brain. That's a weird thing to say, right? No, the brain we have is a brain that has the capacity to do lots of things that are directed at those sorts of goals. Okay, and there's a lot there that is of interest in biological research that hasn't been looked at that much, in part because it's so heterogeneous. Okay, so with those two distinctions, let's look at these two accounts. Okay, one by McShay and one by Mossio and Meek. Okay, so McShay's account, these are his words, a general account of teleology or goal-directedness. And he says there's two things that you need to explain, persistence and plasticity. Why does something reach a goal, even though it might get knocked off course at some point, it sort of gets back on course. Okay? And if you start it from different places, it can still get there. And his basic strategy is to replace goals with field conditions, right? This is, again, his words. A critical part of what gives apparently teleological entities their persistence and plasticity is the fact that they move or change within a larger containing structure, one that directs their behavior in a general way without precisely determining it. Now, if you're listening, you might notice, like, this is very naturally an extrinsic account because it's an outside thing directing, right, in that way. Okay, so if you want to sort of think about that, it's why does the bacterium move in a nutrient gradient? It's because of that field of the nutrient gradient that directs the bacterium to move in that sophisticated way, just like it does in PowerPoint, right? Now, another account, which is different, is from Mossio and Beek, and they argue that they want to provide a characterization of teleology that specifically applies to the biological domain. They start from the notion of self-determination. Again, you can immediately think, oh wait, self-determination, I bet we've got an intrinsic account because we're giving an account in terms of an internal motivation. So this is the way they gloss it. Biological organization determines itself in the sense that the effects of its activity contribute to establish and maintain its own conditions of existence. In slogan form, biological systems are what they do. And so those conditions for existence, right, are the maintenance of one's self, one's organism structure, right? It's teleological because the existence of a biological system depends on what it does. So the system can be regarded as the end or the goal of its own activity, right? So why does the broken wing display take the form that it does? Well, it's so that the bird can sort of preserve the lineage of its offspring, right, in a certain way. Now, on this account, what's really important to them is thinking about certain kinds of recursive structures that we can observe. And so we can zoom in on a way in which certain kinds of interactions that occur within a system have a kind of circular causal structure that supports them, right? So the organism does something that helps it do something else, that helps it do something else, that helps it do that original thing. There's a kind of circularity to that, right? And so we think about the ways in which the kinds of activities that we engage in oftentimes support other activities. So think about your organ systems, right? Your lungs, right, supply oxygen. The oxygen is circulated by your blood, which is pumped by the heart, right? And then as the nutrients are circulated in the body from your digestion, right, then they support the lungs themselves to continue giving you the oxygen you need, right? So there's a kind of circularity inherent. So this is the focus when they think about these kind of regimes of, and they call them closure of constraints, right? a local and contingent cause that reduces degrees of freedom of a process and is stable over the time scale at which the causal action is exerted. And their activity, at least some of the constraints which enable that very activity to maintain it. So biological systems achieve closure of constraints in which the activity of the system contributes to determining and fulfilling the conditions of its own existence. So the organism supports itself staying alive. And in a kind of fundamental constitutive way, what it is to be an organism is to maintain yourself and to stay alive, okay? And this is not just the mere closure of material causes, right? Because there are ways in which we can see cycles in sort of non-living systems, weather systems, and you can even envision like a hurricane as having a kind of sort of closure of processes that for a certain time scale. But in this case, you don't get the same closure structure that's associated with living systems, right? So what it is to zoom in on all those possible things and identify some subset of them that's got this circular architecture of reinforcing. Now, both these accounts pose as general accounts of teleology, right? That is, they say, this is biological teleology. They don't say this is one way of thinking about it or one way of looking at it. They say, this is biological teleology. But of course, as you can now see, they're not the same account and they are very different, right? And in particular, they recognize that they are different with respect to the extrinsic and intrinsic account, right? And notice that we've tapped back into this very old root, because where was that intrinsic extrinsic debate started? It was in ancient Greece. Plato and Aristotle had that same sort of clash about how to think about teleology, right? But here's the key move. There's no good a priori reason to think that there's only a single source of biological teleology. That is, no reason to think that you have to have only one account, that only one of them could possibly be the right way to think about it, right? And in fact, what may be much more plausible is that biological teleology corresponds to a variety of different causal regimes in the world, which we are capturing with our representations, and they need to be accounted for differently. So instead of seeing them as two different accounts of what teleology is at combat with one another, we might envision them as two different models of teleology that grab onto different parts of the way the world works and can help us understand those things and are ultimately in some level compatible, right? So that's the move then to modeling, right? Say, okay, what if we move away from a battle of accounts to how do we investigate this, right? I think that's more plausible in certain ways, but especially plausible if we just, for the moment, say, take them as models, see what happens. As models, they involve abstractions and idealizations, right? So an abstraction is just when you let detail go, right? Idealization is when you treat a system like you know it's not, right? So an abstraction might say, you know, abstract away from color properties and just treat things in terms of their, material hardness or something like that. You just ignore it. But you might think of an idealization as, envision there's no friction when I know there's friction, right? So I know it's not the case, but I still assume otherwise. That's a typical idealization. And we do that in the sciences all the time, right? To focus on different causal patterns. But in fact, what we also see is that they give you some things and they make other things harder to see. That is, there's a kind of trade-off when you make these modeling decisions. And in fact, you can see that in both of these accounts of teleology. So on McShay's account, the insides turn out to be things he doesn't care about, right? In fact, this is what he says, just an entity with certain response properties, right? Right. But maybe that's a quasi-plausible if you're talking about a bacterium, but it's less plausible if you're talking about the bird, right? Just an entity with certain response properties, right? But of course, it makes sense as a modeling decision because he wants to locate the causal action outside in terms of that enveloping field, right, as the active causal agent. That then allows you to say, what's the source of directionality underlying this goal-directed behavior? So he is able to address one question, but he actually closes off other questions at the same time. How did the system get those properties in the first place, right? To be able to respond like that. It's just not on the agenda of this approach, okay? By contrast, Masio et al. Do the opposite. For them, the environment's uninteresting, right? It's just background, it's there, right? But all the causal actions inside, in the system, with the closure of constraints and the sort of circular causal regimes that set up the capacity to maintain itself. They then can characterize an inherently teleological causal regime, which says something about living systems being distinct, but it actually doesn't tell you anything about the living system's engagement with the environment, because it's just not a part of the explanatory strategy in that kind of model. Okay, so instead of trying to subsume everything under an externalist scheme or subsume everything under an intrinsic or internalist kind of scheme, right? We suggest shifting away from what is teleology to questions about sequences of modeling decisions that are utilized in trying to understand this. So what we can say is the questions they're interested in asking are good questions, right? But they are not mutually exclusive, and one is not necessarily more important than the other. Okay, when we regard the accounts as models involving idealizations and abstractions, it can be appreciated that they employ different assumptions. Given the diversity of causal patterns associated with dynamic teleology, remember dynamic teleology is very heterogeneous, there's a number of things that fall underneath it. Adopt a pluralist stance and say, you know, we need different models of teleology. Right? Teleology is many different things. Okay, diversity of phenomena, right? Trade-offs in thinking about how we model those phenomena. And in fact, also differences in investigative aims, research questions, and methodological orientation. All of these things give us reason to think probably a single answer to a question, what is teleology, is going to be pretty limiting for what we might want to do scientifically. Okay, so now, well, how does that help us potentially do better science or advance thinking? Well, we can think about that along a couple different lines. First off, take the intrinsic-extrinsic distinction in the first place. It presumes a certain kind of distinction between the insides and the outsides. Right? But in fact, insides and outsides turn out to be complicated, right? That is, when we start to look at things closer, boundaries are not quite as obvious as they might be intuitively, right? And so we can actually decide like, what counts as the boundary depending on our questions. We can decide. This is where you draw the boundary. No, in this case, we're going to draw the boundary differently because of different question, different aim, right? So this is just one example, again, to make it concrete. The cell membrane may seem like an intuitive natural boundary, but if the aim is to comprehend the signaling dynamics for a cell type, then the extracellular matrix outside the cell can be an intrinsic feature because the capacity of the cell receptors to respond is modulated by changes in what's going on outside. But maybe that's not your question. And if it's not, then maybe you would choose different sorts of characterizations of the boundaries, right? So think back to our broken wing example for a moment, right? Notice that we made some presumptions about where the system was and where the boundaries were. We can actually make some different choices, right? Do we want the parental bird to be the system? Do we want the parental bird plus the offspring and nest? Do we want to include the predator, right? How do we want to think about that? Well, that's a modeling choice, right? We don't necessarily think one of those is going to be the best way. We think probably we'll learn something different by making different choices about what counts as a system. And that's going to be especially critical when you start to think about what counts as an ecosystem, right? What counts as in and out for that, right? And you start to think about larger systems, you're going to have really complicated decisions about where the boundaries lie. And you're going to want to be able to say, I make a choice, here are the trade-offs, and then recognize that I might want to revisit that choice to get at the things I can't see in the first choice because of those trade-offs. Right. Second thing is parts and wholes, right? Models of teleology generally assume that systems are composed of parts or traits that contribute to these patterns that we see, right? But what part-whole relations are salient can depend on the question of view, right? And in fact, one of the things that has been highlighted many times is that depending on your perspective, you can actually take a whole and decompose it into different kinds of parts. So focusing on the metabolic dynamics of physiological stress responses, which involve specific hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, right? I might actually be abstracting or idealizing the immune system, which involves antibodies and white blood cells. So I pay attention to some parts because those are the parts of the system I'm interested in. I ignore the parts that might be thought of in another system, or think of even your biological education, right? You have a class on anatomy, and the anatomy class divides things up in a certain way, but then you do a discussion of the cardiovascular system, and all of a sudden, right, the cardiovascular system is everywhere. And you have to think about the parts and their relations in slightly different ways. Okay, again, notice we can do the same thing with the broken wing display, right? What are we going to zoom in on as the relevant parts? We've already talked a little bit about different wholes. Now we can think about different parts, right? So this is just giving you a little bit of that possibility space that the scientist gets to choose. What am I going to pay attention to and focus on, right? And notice they're all things that are relevant, right? Nest properties, properties of the offspring, ability to move, vocalization, right? Because part of the broken wing display is sometimes a chirping to draw attention of the predator. Again, decisions can be made, trade-offs would then be recognized with different decisions. This is relevant especially to thinking about the microbiome. Some of you may be more or less familiar with this, but we've now discovered over the last couple decades that we carry around with us more than half of our cells are not human cells, right? I like to joke that every once in a while the bacteria are getting the upper hand, and then we go to the bathroom and we even things out, right? Well, what counts as parts or whole? Do my bacteria count as parts of me? Am I maybe better thought of as an ecosystem in which my cells are one component of the ecosystem, and the bacteria and fungi that live in my digestive system or on my skin or another part of the system? Doesn't have to be one answer to that. It's a modeling choice. Maybe under some circumstances, I want to model it as them as part of me. In other circumstances, you can model it as a system of which I'm a part. Finally, timescales, right? Once a boundary between a system and environment has been drawn and a decision is made about part-whole decomposition, we have to say, on what timescale are we going to pay attention to interactions, right? Because depending on the timescale of interest, you'll see different things, right? What happens over minutes as opposed to what happens over hours, right? We've all seen the time-lapse photography, right? Which, you know, if we could sit there and watch for 24 hours, a lot happens that we don't see if we are only watching for 10 minutes. Oftentimes, causal interactions at lower levels of organization happen faster. Causal interactions at higher levels of organization happen on longer timescales. So certain kinds of chemical reactions going on in cells are happening very fast. Much faster than words are coming out of my mouth at the higher level. So you can think about this, here's just an example. The activity of sensory and motor neurons that underlie skeletal and muscle elements of the head are modeled differently from the biomechanical projectile behavior of a tongue in securing prey. Timescale of the tongue's movement is different from the timescale of the neuronal signaling. Again, we can actually look at the broken wing example and sort of say, well, what time scale do we want to pay attention to? And we can make decisions about how to do that and what kinds of things we might find if we shift time scales, because different things are happening on different time scales. Okay, and you can actually see this on the broadest scale in thinking about the relationship between individual behavior and the fossil record, right? So what you have here is a representation of millions and millions of years, right? But notice that the thing being highlighted in the representation of abundance is actually individuals, right? Because bioturbation, that's basically digging around in the dirt, right? Predatory behavior, right? Predators are chasing prey. Those are individual level events, right? And those things are then being looked at on a longer time scale to see what kind of effect do they have, right? Bioturbation might not seem like much over 10 days, but what about over 2 million years? So you can think about those sorts of effects on even longer timescales. So in terms of the scientific payoff, what we're doing is we're making the evaluative standards explicit. What we're saying is because we're paying attention to these things, we can say, how did you draw your boundaries? How did you decompose into parts? What time scale did you choose? And then you can know whether or not you have competing or complementary explanations. Because then the scientists make explicit what they're doing to other scientists, which you might think they do that all the time. They don't necessarily do that all the time. Okay. That foregrounds the modeling decisions that generate those trade-offs, as well as differences in aims, questions, and methods. In particular, like I highlighted, it allows you to see to what degree is something a model that competes with another model, as opposed to a model that's complementary because it's focused on a different question and built on different assumptions. So some of those controversies that we saw that were sort of deep in the history of philosophy, Plato versus Aristotle on intrinsic versus extrinsic teleology, might actually be seen as differences in priorities for how you make some of these modeling choices of the phenomena, right? And approaches may be more complementary than previously imagined, right? People might actually realize, oh wait, we're not fighting. We actually can see a way to put these two pieces together, or at least understand that we're not under competition. So, conclusion. There's ample scope for philosophical and scientific work on teleology beyond functions. I think this is facilitated by adopting a pluralist stance and by treating these philosophical accounts of teleology as models that involve different idealizations and abstractions. You also get scientific payoffs from these, right? By looking at what the scientists are doing and realizing that they are modeling teleology differently. They're making assumptions about what counts as the inside, what counts as the outside, what counts as the whole, what counts as the part, and what kind of time scale to evaluate causal interactions over. And that really points towards teleology being a kind of multi-dimensional phenomena, right? So part of the reason why you don't want to say what is teleology is because in some sense teleology is many things. And if you frame the question in a certain way, you can actually mislead yourself into thinking that there's a kind of single answer to it. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Okay, everyone, who wants to start us off with questions?
Okay, so this like field is not entirely familiar to me. My familiarity with the term teleology, I'm thinking of like religious, scientific, naturalistic, don't know if that's the right word, like arguments for way things should be. Like if that makes sense.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, can biology be looked at in a non-teleological manner, or do you think that it should just be looked at in different varieties of teleology?
So good question. The one thing you might ask is whether or not teleology has some implicit norms in it. I think that was part of what you were highlighting about the way the world should be, right? And teleology doesn't imply norms that are necessarily non-naturalistic, right? So think about, again, the sharp teeth of the tiger, right? Should the teeth of the tiger be sharp? I think we can answer yes, right? But the yes is a yes by virtue of the history of tigers. That is, the reason why tigers should have sharp teeth is because they're a lineage of carnivores that makes a living eating this way. And therefore, if a tiger was not to have sharp teeth, it couldn't actually do the things it needs to survive and reproduce, right? So there's a kind of norm there, but it's a much more muted norm. It doesn't have kind of the religious or kind of worldview type overtones about it, right? Notice also that we can say that certain things are not teleological, right? So I can say that while it's the case that a nice, fuzzy bunny makes a nice meal for the tiger, I do not have to say that the bunny is there for the sake of the tiger, right? So the tiger can have the sharp teeth for the sake of catching something, but that doesn't mean the thing that it caught was for its sake, right? So there are ways of which we can talk about what's going on non-teleologically as well. However, what this is sort of highlighting is that there are some pretty natural places in biology where it seems like if we're going to try and analyze it non-teleologically, we're probably going to run into some trouble, right? Because so if you were to say, well, why does the tiger have sharp teeth? Don't answer teleologically in any way, right? Well, you could say it's chance, right? It just happened. That's not very plausible, right? In part for the same reasons that Aristotle would have said, but this happens always or for the most part. And things that happen always for the most part are not good candidates for chance explanations. Or you might argue that it's just a consequence of the physics of the system. And, during embryogenesis, the physics interact just so to give you sharp teeth. And again, the concern is that there doesn't seem to be anything in the physics that says you would get sharp teeth rather than flat teeth or no teeth or anything like that, because the physical forces and physical interactions of the materials are consistent with all of those outcomes. So I think in summarizing an answer to your question, you can have norms, but they're not as loaded. You can analyze systems non-teleologically, but we have reason to think that some systems are probably going to best be understood teleologically. And then it's a matter of getting into this space of what kind of teleology and what kind of modeling decisions can we make. Does that help?
Yes, I would have a follow-up question, but I might give others a chance to
Okay,
ask
sure.
questions. Yes.
Yeah, this is really great. Thank you so much. Really interested in the extent to which you're specifically talking about biological systems.
Yeah.
And teleology as a means to model biological systems and the way that they self-perpetuate and interact with themselves. But what exactly would the boundaries of that be? Because I imagine if I were to say like a proton, like atoms have electrons in order to bond, that feels inappropriate. It feels bizarre. If I say like stars cluster in galaxies for a purpose, that also feels bizarre.
Yep.
But like you've been demonstrating, there are a lot of reasons that it's really meaningful to talk teleologically about biological systems. Do you have any insight on what those boundaries could be or why biological systems are different?
I mean, I think that at some level, all the way back to antiquity, there's a recognition that what seems to distinguish living systems from non-living systems is something like teleological regimes. I think that what has happened over time is there's a recognition that there's not a single analysis of what that consists in, hence the need for multiple models of it, but that in some sense, the accounts that we're giving are bounded by that which is living. And that if we shift into talking about non-living systems, we could technically invoke teleology, but it feels superfluous and unnecessary to do so, and potentially misleading, right? And I think that's, as people have been thinking about, well, how to understand living systems, people have said, well, living systems are just physical material, right? But of course, all the people who are involved here acknowledge that living systems are physical material, but what they're interested in is that they seem to be organized differently. And that we want to pay attention to what that organizational difference is, right? That seems to stand out and call for a different kind of analysis. Now, you might then say, well, what's the boundary between the living and the unliving, right? That's a really tricky question, right? So take an example that kind of points it out, viruses. Are viruses alive, right? Well, viruses certainly have a lot of the properties that we're talking about here in terms of their capacity to replicate and having certain properties for, say the sake of, having a capsid protein that holds your nucleic acids until they can be dumped into a cell and propagated. But people don't necessarily agree on whether viruses are alive. So my own kind of take on this is that we should be careful about worrying about the boundary cases, because the boundary cases are, I think, going to oftentimes be fuzzy. And so instead of worrying about, can we draw the bright line between life and non-life, I think, there's probably a fuzzy space there, but that doesn't mean we can't look and say, but that's clearly not living and that's clearly alive, right? So just because the viruses are a tricky case doesn't mean that the tiger and the star are a tricky case, right? And oftentimes, if we look at the way the sciences oftentimes work by carving up domains so that they can focus on those that are a little bit clearer, right? In certain ways, because if you spend too much time on the boundary cases, then you can get stuck in kind of semantic disagreement. And scientists, unlike philosophers, don't like semantic disagreement. They try and avoid it. Sometimes to their detriment, but they typically don't like it.
Okay, Calvin,
Yeah, we have time.
yeah, we're technically out, but who cares?
Yeah, I was wondering if we do draw the line, the boundary at what can be teleological and what can't. I guess roughly speaking, since you could draw it between what's alive and what's not alive. I was kind of puzzled by McShay, I think it was McShay's.
Yes.
It being all external.
Yeah.
How do you draw, I mean, it seems for them there isn't a line then. It's just we're all just machines. So I'm wondering how that's teleology.
So actually, it's a very astute observation on your part. In fact, the McShay account bites the bullet on the boundary and just says, yeah, some stuff that's not living is teleological also. So that's an interesting consequence of that account. It's not true of all extrinsic accounts of teleology. It's actually something that's distinctive to Shay's account. But you're right that in a sense, the resources don't let them stop. They have to extend that. And actually, I know Dan, and I've talked to him about it, and he says he just bites the bullet.
Anyone else? Well, if we're willing, then Zuha, would you like to ask your follow-up?
Let's see if I can remember what my question was going to be. I think what I was wondering about was so I understand the difference between the example you gave of the rabbit, not being there for the tiger to eat it as being non-teleological, but the tiger's development of sharp teeth being teleological. My question is okay, so when you're using teleological in this sense, do you mean that when the tiger is developing in the womb, it's teleological in the sense like there's some sort of, I don't know biology, genetic sequencing or something, whatever that contributes to the form of the teeth forming, is that teleological in the sense of that, or the actual persistent development of the teeth being?
So it's going to depend a little bit. So you're getting at actually different causal regimes that you might pay attention to in thinking about teleology. So I can think about the teleology of the tiger in a more historical evolutionary sense, right? Or I can think about it in the sense of development within one generation, right? And that's going to mean that I pay attention to different things, right? So if I think about it historically, I'm going to pay attention to repeated interactions between tiger and its prey, such that those tigers with sharper teeth survive and reproduce better than those tigers that don't, right? So notice I'm at a high level of causal interaction there in terms of organism to organism, right? But if I want to say, well, I've got a tiger embryo here, and then the tiger is going to develop into an adult tiger with sharp teeth, why does that trajectory happen? Now I've shifted into a different causal regime. I'm paying attention to these interactions during embryogenesis. And some people would want to appeal to certain kinds of genetic interactions that are happening each generation to produce those sharp teeth. So this would be a great case where there's not an incompatibility. There's actually, I'm shifting to a different set of causes in trying to understand the teleology that's in that observation of the sharp teeth. However, I would say that that's part of the controversy because it's unclear from the study of certain processes during development that you would be able to pinpoint what is it about the genetic sequences that yield that. A lot of what we know about development is that the outcomes are due to interactions. And so the reliability of the interactions are not necessarily coded in the DNA because they actually require the physical location of cells, which is not something that the DNA necessarily has encoded in it. And so then you would appeal to a different set of causes to generate that wouldn't be only the DNA. So you could have controversy about, well, what are the causes that we should really be paying attention to? Maybe there's, these rather than that, but they would be on a different time scale. They would be an appeal to different kinds of parts than that evolutionary history time scale that was looking at survival and reproduction with respect to predator-prey interactions. And so there would be compatibility between those two different kinds of study. Does that help?
Yes, that does clarify. Can I follow up? Is that okay?
Sure.
The reason why I was asking was because I can understand it more on like a minute level where it's like focusing maybe like on a generation, but then when there's like kind of this like long, like a top down, like looking at like, oh, they've been developing sharp teeth for a while now because of such and such, I feel resistant to giving it a teleological like explanation because I'm like, I view evolution as being like a chance thing, and it persisted not because the teeth were for hunting, but because the ones who had no teeth did not survive. But does that imply that the teeth came into existence for hunting, or just that it happened to work in the environment that the animal was in?
So you're highlighting sort of a longer sequence. So if my contrast class was sharper versus duller teeth, I'm gonna have a certain kind of explanation. If my contrast is teeth, no teeth, right, I'm gonna have a different sort of structure of the explanation, right? I don't think that you have to deny a role for chance in thinking about evolution this way. But importantly, like there's two places that you can sort of think about chance entering in the evolutionary processes. One is in the origin of variation. Why does a particular mutation happen at one time or another? just could be thermodynamic fluctuations. There's not a reason why, right? There's a chance of that. Then you could also have what we might think of as chance events, that, tiger A encounters bunny B rather than bunny C, right? And it was a chance encounter. Nothing special about bunny B made it show up to the tiger easier than bunny C. Just so happened that that was the way things unfolded. So those sorts of chance events are all part of the evolutionary process. However, to say that evolution is a chance process, we have to be careful that we don't exclude the fact that selection processes are not chance, right? When this group of tigers with sharper teeth survives and reproduces more than this group, that's not chance, right? That's a consequence of the causal interactions. So typically what biologists will want to say is that the long-term evolutionary outcome is a combination of selection and chance, right? Because there will be that combination of chance origins of variation, selective events happening by chance, and then selection, which is preserving things that work, rejecting things that don't. And it's the combination of those two that give you the outcome. So the way I would typically then say is that we shouldn't say that evolution is a deterministic process, because that would be to put selection and ignore chance. But we don't want to say evolution is an indeterministic process, because in fact, there are reasons why certain sorts of, so think about, similarities of dolphins and sharks and body shape, right? Like that's because that's an efficient way to swim. And evolution converges on that because of the selection processes, even though those are very divergent lineages that are not closely related, cartilaginous fishes and mammals, right? So what we need is some account of evolution that combines both deterministic causal interactions and indeterministic chance together.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for Dr. Love?
Yes, I have a quick one then.
Okay.
So how far exactly do you think we can sort of abstract out with this using teleology to describe biological systems? Can we say, for instance, that complex, organic, self-replicating, energy-consuming life exists for the purpose, or exists because it increases entropy more efficiently than other alternatives do, for instance?
So I think we want to be careful that the teleology doesn't kind of extend too far, and actually for good scientific reasons as well, right? So kind of slogan in philosophy of science is that if your explanation explains everything, it probably doesn't explain anything, right? That is, a good explanation has a certain kind of domain where it does the work, and it does the work there, but not everywhere, right? So I think something similar is true of teleology. The kind of productive application of teleology is when it is applied to the domain. And if we try and extend it too far, right, we end up not helping ourselves. And so I think we want to be able to say, this is fruitfully studied teleologically, this is not fruitfully studied teleology, and have good reasons for deciding between when to do one and when to do the other. Some of that has to do with the boundary that we might draw between the living and the non-living. But some of it might also be that we think there are good reasons to not see something teleological. So a classic concern is, some people would say, is the evolutionary process itself teleological, right? That somehow, are there sort of outcomes that it's arcing towards? Well, that's a sense of teleology that doesn't work well. It doesn't seem like it has good justification, because we don't have any reason to think that this extended historical process is going in a particular direction, right? At least from our scientific knowledge, right? So thinking about the whole evolutionary process teleological, probably not a good idea, right? However, figuring out the broken wing bird display, okay, there I think we should be deploying teleological notions because we're trying to understand why does the bird do what it does and why is that behavior operative in a certain causal regime of the bird and its offspring and the predator and the like. And so anytime teleology sort of maybe creeps beyond its boundaries, we might actually be naturally skeptical. But what's, I think, the kind of talk that I gave today is in part a response to, and I saw this in the opening quotes, people who want to say you can never talk about it, right? That somehow it'd have to be forbidden altogether. I think that's also too strong, right? It doesn't explain everything, but it's also that it's not that it does nothing. It's finding the right kind of middle Goldilocks kind of strategy.
So in terms of actually finding that, would you say, it's just a matter of trial and error?
Yes,
See what
so
works?
right. So what I would say is I don't think there's any a priori analysis that will deliver us the boundaries of when it's workable and when it's not. So some of the reason why we think it's not a good reason to model the evolutionary process as a whole as teleological is actually because of what we know about the process and what we've learned about the process. And so it doesn't make sense to do that. So yeah, we're not going to have some way of like intuiting what those, in fact, one of the most active areas of research right now in some of these things is to what degree can we think of ecosystems as teleologically organized in some sense, okay? And the reason why people resisted that was precisely because of the answer I gave before, which it was like, well, but the rabbit's not there for the sake of the tiger. That's the wrong way of thinking about that, right? But some of these notions about like a regime of closure, like if you can somehow capture that, could that be applied? Well, that's actually an open question, right? There are some people who think this is helpful. There are some people who think, I don't really see it yet. Well, stay tuned. That one's not settled yet. And I think that that's part of also a kind of philosophy of science disposition to the fact that some of what you are looking at is not finished, right? The sciences are in motion and you want to be careful not to freeze frame them too much because then you might be kind of missing that actually that's something that you should maybe sit back and watch, right? And understand what's going on and not think, oh, this is like all finished and ready to be like tidied up or something.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is that it? So let's give one more thank you to Dr. Rowan. And lastly, let's give one thank you to Gus for organizing this whole conference for us. So technically, we are 17 minutes over time, but given that facilities maintenance shift started about 17 minutes ago, I'd say we have some time to mingle and eat if you want.
Thanks one more time to all our wonderful presenters, and to Dr. Alan Love for taking the time out of his day to share that fantastic keynote with us. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We enjoyed having you here at Epistemai's 2024 Philosophy Conference, and we hope to see you again next year.